Welcome to this event, which is sponsored by the Islam and the Humanities Research Project in the Center for Middle East Studies here at Brown. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Tony Stewart today. Professor Stewart is the Gertrude Conway Vanderbilt Chair in the Humanities at Vanderbilt and a professor of religious studies. He is a very distinguished scholar of Indian literatures generally, but especially Bengali. He has done critical work, kind of really central work on figures such as Chaitanya, a very important figure in the development of Indian religious traditions. He has also published regarding Sufism, and so he has this earlier book that was published a number of years ago that is called Fabulous Females and Peerless Peers, which is translations of the types of materials that he will be talking about today. But I bring this up, this particular book up, especially because I think the title will give you a sense of a kind of very interesting playfulness that is part of Professor Stewart's work. And his work actually, there's a long list of publications that I'm not going to go through here, but for my purposes, what it represents is two things that are combined in an amazingly good way. One is very, very interesting stories, eyes for stories that are worth telling and retelling, and then theoretical discussion about what to make of these stories in the context of humanities work. And those two things sometimes are not combined together. People do one or the other. I think his work is truly exemplary for combining the two together. And it's partly because of this I was delighted when he agreed to submit a book proposal to a book series that I edit for the University of California Press called Islamic Humanities. And his book, Witness to Marvels, came out last year. And so part of what we are doing today in this event is to hear him speak about something that is going to go forward from this book, but also to celebrate the publication of this wonderful volume, which to my mind is really truly a major intervention in the study of literature, Islam, Sufism, and generally how to think about stories, religious stories, as a type of very interesting historical social data. So please welcome Professor Stewart.
Thank you, Shahzad. That was very generous. I also want to thank the Islam and Humanities Project of the Center for Middle East Studies. I was delighted when he agreed to let me submit that book to his series, and I was even more delighted, of course, that it came out. What I want to do today is not talk directly from the book, but talk about some things that developed while I was writing the book and which cross the book. And I think there's no point in me just repeating what you can go and read for yourself. So this is all new material. Many years ago, while mining the treasures of the handwritten Bangla manuscripts, the Hastalikhito Punti as they're called, of the miraculous tales that form the subject matter of my recent monograph, Witness to Marvels, those zany narratives of Bon Bibi, Gaji Pir, and Shatto Pir, I discovered that all of those tales had somehow migrated into the print literatures of Bengal in the 19th century and beyond. What I want to do today is try to reconstruct some sense of that meandering discovery. So please forgive me what will no doubt appear to be a rather rambling presentation at times, but one that will, I hope, highlight the necessity of never blithely accepting the conventional wisdom of the academic classification of literatures, and especially when religion is involved. The long, often incredibly convoluted literary productions of the 16th, 17th, and 18th century tales were severely truncated by the time they hit print in the 19th century. The most extreme case I found was a 700-page text of Gaji, Kalu, and Champavati, which was reduced to 88 small pages, which you see the cover here. But it was only after comparing a number of these texts that I also observed that these adventure quest narratives slowly transformed into some kind of, and I'm not quite sure how to classify them, but we'll say not quite didactic pieces. As the length shriveled, the author as murshid or teacher emerged from the shadows, not just intermittently in the body of the text, the typical bonita or signature line, which historically provided some autobiographical information, but more overtly in framing the overall text and select episodes within the text. These interventions often made perspicacious observations or delivered instruction that was explicitly religious, though I did notice frequently seeming to be disconnected from the narratives. There was a disjunction. Initially, I paid little attention to these disruptions of the literary narrative, and when I did finally notice it, I generally wrote it off to authorial difference, or in worst cases, a form of textual piracy or interpolation by a later, less skilled author or editor. An unfortunate, and I might add much too quick, value judgment that caused me to dismiss when it should have caused me to focus more intently. As one author, Shaib Munshi Abdul Wahab, wrote by way of introduction to his version of the tale of Gaji, Kalu, and Champavati, he writes at the end of his preface, "Those who are learned and perceptive can infer meaning through hints, insinuation, and implication. Consequently, this preface will appear to some as opaque and cryptically dense." Well, I'm here to tell you, it took me about 3 weeks to translate those 3 pages, and I'm still not confident that I got it. But cryptically dense indeed. I took my cue and dismissed the 3 seemingly disconnected pages of his prefatory frame and subsequent periodic insertions. That was a mistake. And let me suggest why, though my explanation may appear to be a little long-winded before we reach the critical point. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, the intellectual ferment in Bengal had reached a nearly fever pitch, and not surprisingly, the locus of these activities was in the metropolitan regions of Calcutta in the west and Dhaka in the eastern regions of the Bangla-speaking world. The myriad factors contributing to this ferment included both mainstream and radical politics, social reform, religious innovation, shifting colonial rule, and perhaps as important as anything else, the introduction of the printing press. Baptist missionaries were the first to utilize the technology, with William Carey and his cohort developing a movable Bangla font in order to print the Bible and other proselytizing propaganda. His first New Testament translation into Bangla was in 1801, which you see pictured here. Hickey's Bengal Gazette was the first English-language newspaper printed in India, appearing in Calcutta in 1780, but had its license revoked 2 years later for being critical of the colonial administration. It would be about 30 years before the first Bangla-language periodical was published, the Somachar Darpan, edited by John Clark Marshman at the Baptist Missionary Society that was founded by William Carey. It ran from 1818 to 1841. Note, however, that the publisher and editor were not Bengali. There were severe restrictions against Bengalis owning or operating printing presses, but before the demise of the Somachar Darpan, these restrictions were gradually lifted. And soon, Calcutta, Dhaka, Murshidabad, Noida, Sylhet, Chittagong, and other cities were bristling with publications in English and Bangla. The book trade escalated at a rate that today would make Wall Street analysts salivate. The earliest publications tended to be religious text, but by mid-century, the market saw a mix of romances, poetry, translations of European classics, philosophical and ethical literature, science textbooks, and eventually the new literary form for Bangla, the novel. Because Hindu populations in Bengal have enjoyed historically high literacy rates, along with those of the southwestern state of Kerala, the highest in India, this efflorescence of 19th century literary production, scholars have called the Bengal Renaissance. But in its portrayal, it is inevitably a Hindu affair. And I have a colleague who's written 4 monographs on the topic of the Bengal Renaissance, and in those 4 monographs, only once used the word Muslim. The overwhelming number of Muslims, and they form the majority population in the Bangla-speaking world then as well as now, were illiterate farmers. So scholars have historically considered them of negligible importance, indeed impervious to the wholesale changes going on around them: education, social reform, economic development, political action, and so forth. Now, during this same period, in the name of creating a Bengali national literature, the venerable literary historian D.C. Shen generated a 1,000-page history of Bengali language and literature. But he barely acknowledged the existence of the Muslim so-called Dobashi literature, that is two-language literature, producing then a de facto Hindu nationalist literary history. His reasons for excluding Dobashi, that is Musulmani Bangla, that is the Bangla that is used for compositions for Muslims by Muslims, and he treated Dobashi and Musulmani Bangla as coterminous, and in fact they both have long but intertwined histories. But his reasons for doing this are rather thinly veiled, and I refer you to a direct quotation. The works of Mohammedan writers mentioned in this book are all written more or less Sanskritized Bengali, and not in that style known as Musulmani Bangla, which shows an admixture of Urdu, Persian, and Arabic words with corrupt Bengali. A vast literature of the rustic Mohammedans is to be found written in Musulmani Bangla, and there are many works of this class, some of which may be traced back to the 16th century. But for various reasons, we have not found it convenient to include books written in Musulmani Bangla in the present work. Similarly, S.K. Chatterjee, the venerable linguist, whose category formation excluded Persian as part of Bangla, adds, and I quote here, "The literature in Musulmani Bangla has no merit, and some of the deathless tales of pre-Muslim Persia, as in the Shahnameh, and of early Islam have been ruined by the hack versifiers of Calcutta and Chittagong in rendering them in this jargon." A few decades later, in his iconic literary history titled Bangla Sahityer Itihash, which covers nearly 3,000 pages, Shukumar Sen essentially refused to acknowledge any literature generated by Muslims, save a handful of early modern writers such as Alao. Now, what does this have to do with my story, you might reasonably ask? The literary snobbery, intentional but perhaps naive, was consistent with and no doubt contributed to a number of tacit assumptions that generated an economy of relative cultural values that in their extreme forms became standardized codes, unspoken codes that shaped the academy and public institutions of government in the Bangla-speaking world. Directly germane to our project, these assumptions dictated collecting decisions by institutions such as the Asiatic Society, Calcutta University, the Bengal Literary Society, the Bangla Sahitya Porishad, the Bangla Academy, and the India Office Library. It was clear that real or serious Muslim literatures were in Urdu, Farsi, or Arabic, even though Musulmani Bangla literatures, according to Abdul Manan, a literary historian, date back to the 13th century. Now, perhaps that's a bit of a nationalistic exaggeration, but not by much, as my own forays into these tales attest. As a result, I can tell you from firsthand experience that much of this literature was and still remains lost to retrieval in these repositories, though we know at least some of it is there, because of the perverse assumption that Muslim authors were so unlettered that they misspelled their own names in Bangla, and it was necessary for the librarians and collectors to correct those back to Persian or Arabic. Ditto for the titles of books. Because of these interventions, many of the books have been lost to Bangla-speaking scholars for a century and a half. And Perso-Arabic scholars would never even dream of consulting a Bangla catalog for such imprints. The not-so-subtle message was clear. Bangla was not a proper medium for Islam, and Bengalis were not proper Muslims. But after spending years, and I mean years, manually sifting through the holdings of the old India Office Library, which is now subsumed into the British Library, in the National Library in Kolkata, and a host of other repositories on both sides of the border, I found hundreds of publications that are clearly written by Muslims, not only for their own kind, but for a broader readership. There was a vibrant intellectual life among Muslims, and not just elites. Publishing houses such as Siddiqui Library, Gaussiya Library, Habibi Press, Mohammadi Library, Mohammadi Book Depository, and Bishambor Laha generated tens of thousands of inexpensive books. One scholar of the publishing activities notes that in spite of the paucity of collecting, the India Office Library had recorded that in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, Musalmani Bangla publications averaged more than 1,000 titles per year, though collection averaged, in some cases, not more than a handful. Prominent among these books, not surprisingly, were stories of Muhammad and his family, the stories of the prophets, largely based on retellings and translations of Persian antecedents, since Arabic was not nearly as prevalent even among the learned Bengali ulama. The largest body of printed texts, however, came under the label of Nasihat Namas, instructional manuals. True to its genre descriptor, much of the literature was focused on instruction in the practice of Sharia, on being a good Muslim. Regardless of the narrative tack, a good percentage of these texts were homiletic in nature, and they told stories and quoted scripture for edification of the auditor, for most were read out loud, with the emphasis focusing on basic comportment and ritual propriety. But strangely enough, roughly half of the productions in this genre were not theological or ethical instruction, but historical fictions and outright fictions, tales of mad adventure, romance, and quest tales to entertain the masses. They were not just renditions of the tales that had originated centuries earlier that I had analyzed in Witness to Marvels, but new tales, scores of new tales. It was puzzling to me how these two radically different forms of literature could be lumped together in the single genre of Nasihat Namas. About all they seemed to have in common were shared publishers. Similar productions as typical chapbooks or Bottola productions, that is 16, 24, 36, 48-page productions, on cheap paper and inexpensively priced. Clearly, the classification itself has never been problematized. Notably, advertisements on the covers included both types of literatures, which no scholar has ever questioned. Without having to resort to stereotype, the conservative moralizing texts were generated primarily by Sharia-minded Sunni preachers and frequently included scathing diatribes against the subjects and the authors of the other half of the genre, the Sufi peers and fakirs, and the practices of the so-called marfati path of gnosis, which they argued led to dissipation and heresy. In their eyes, the material that constituted the bulk of my analysis in Witness to Marvels was altogether invalid, if not something worse. These admonitory and instructional literatures generated dire warnings about the generally sad state of Muslims in Bengal. Much of the polemic centered on extensive graphic descriptions of the threat and anticipated punishment for those who were not prepared for the final reckoning at the end of time. Dozens of tracts decried the impoverished practices of the Muslim community of Greater Bengal and their bleak future if they did not change their degenerate habits. And I'm going to put up several slides of text just so you can get a taste of the wide range of things. One author deplored the widespread degradation of Muslims by pointedly indicting the members of the community for their failure to learn Arabic or Farsi, suggestive of the growing influence of various reform-minded factions, including the increasing reach of Deoband scholasticism, and not without irony, making them allies to the Orientalist perspectives we noted above regarding the value of Bangla. Using a simpler approach to guide people to become better Muslims, authors gave advice on controlling and overcoming evil habits, and even how to self-identify as Muslims. An entire subgenre was dedicated to the misconduct of women and the need for correctives, proper discipline, and training in female deportment. Much ink was spilled discussing the immodesty of women, including the hot issues of covering and sequestering. In the context of a larger critique of the irreligious behavior of both sexes, another tract on religious instruction goes so far as to attribute a myriad of the troubles of the world to women generally. In an alternative to the direct excoriation of womanly conduct through exhortation and admonition, the well-published and highly respected author Garibullah, circulated a text that included 5 lengthy, edifying tales of exemplary feminine comportment, starting with Bibi Fatima and then working his way chronologically to the present. This is about a 700-page tome. Rewards and punishments prove thematically popular in gender-based arguments, and failures in the areas of propriety by both men and women were often fingered as the instigator of earthquakes, cyclones, famines, and other natural disasters. Human conduct had dire environmental consequences. Maybe it would be nice if our world leaders took a hint here, though for different reasons. I hasten to add that not all authors intent on guiding the public to a better way of life resorted to fire and brimstone, but would adopt a rhetoric that would appeal to a more highly educated and cosmopolitan audience, often adopting rhetorical strategies that presented the message in what today we might characterize, appropriately enough for this venue, a more universal or Islam-informed humanism. But I noticed that to underscore their Sharia-minded instruction, the authors of these tracts frequently targeted Sufis. The institution of the Sufi saint, the pir or fakir, was scathingly criticized. For instance, one tract writer refers to the misguided worship of fake or fanciful pirs, mito pir, and explicitly names Shatto pir and Paglai pir as leading contenders to misguide the public. And Shatto pir, by the way, is the subject of the 6th chapter of the book that I just finished. Clearly, the reputation of mendicant pirs was in question, judging from the frequent charges of misconduct and hypocrisy. Now, in an effort to alert the gullible, some conservative Muslims characterize pirs as charlatans, religious teachers in name only, but who were little more than thieves and scam artists, addicted to luxurious living, indulging their tastes in elegant foods, milking the unwary of their hard-earned rupees. Pirs and fakirs were featured as, and I love this expression, drug-addicted home wreckers in this degraded Kali age. Now notice the time frame is the Hindu Kali age. As Munsi Nasiruddin Shahib and Adin Muhammad Hadek Orfe argued in Jalalat al-Fokra, it was because Sufi marfati practices depended on the guidance of a human teacher, the pir or fakir serving as murshid, that any sober-minded practitioner would see the Sufi path as anathema to Sharia. In that Islamist ritual economy, Sharia, they argued, was founded solely on God's guidance and was the only reliable recourse, where the fallible teachings of a mere human misguided the devotee in this marfati tradition. This jointly authored book especially condemned the mendicants' love of food and food offerings and included an exceptionally pointed diatribe directed at the evil practice of tomb worship as the pathway to shaitan or Satan. And it was even replete with a drawing on page 13 that graphically illustrated the results of falling into hell. Shaitan, they allege, is said to corrupt the minds of the fakirs by speaking to them through their meditation. So the belief in the sanctity of the pir was not only grounded in the hubris of human ignorance, but was truly diabolical. It gets really tiresome to read these things, I have to say, and which meant I skipped over them for many years until I finally made myself go back and look. As I sat in the Asian and African Studies reading room in the British Library pondering this last indictment, I realized that they had put their finger on something that had previously completely escaped my attention, and which had allowed me innocently to ignore the insertions and framing of the editors or authors that I mentioned above. With the advent of the press, the printed word, as distributed by the conservative mullahs, came to challenge the living instruction provided by the pir as murshid or teacher. So print displaces living authority. The conservative factions invoke the Quran and Hadith sources of eternal authority that lay at the heart of the tradition, and which were extra Bengali. It was only at this juncture I began to see the imperative of the countermove of the pir, who inserted himself authoritatively in the framing of the tales of the marvelous works of those friends of God. And I want to acknowledge one of my graduate students at Jodhpur University, Epshita Halder, was one of the first to point me in this direction. But in spite of the more growing and fervent Islamist drumbeat of condemnation and impending ruination, it would seem that much of the population of the Bangla-speaking world resisted these attempts at suppression or remedial training. One might speculate because there was a sense that people were already conducting themselves as good Muslims, doing their best in what were undoubtedly trying times. Many were not convinced of the reformers' doom and gloom, and the literature included more than a few disdainful lampoons of the excesses of the reformers, such as the ultra-conservative Wahhabis. A number of Bangla speakers, both Musalmani and Hinduani, did then and continue today to hold dear these heroic figures of Pirs and Bibis, Deves and Devis that populate the Pir Kathas, that is, the stories of the Pirs. They used the same print medium, and their publications had the same appearance and often wider circulation than the productions of their reform-oriented counterparts. These counter stories favored narrative over homily, but underscored the presence of the Pir's authority delivered through his narrated presence in the text. The popular Pir Kathas tell of pious men and women who exhibit a charisma and that inevitably attracts people in spite of the pressure of legislative authority brought by legal scholars within the more conservative sections of the mainstream tradition. Why, I had to ask, did these fictions have such a grip on the population? They do entertain. That's usually how they're dismissed. But they also educate through their romantic narrative structures. Perhaps more importantly, and this will constitute a central argument in what follows, rather than closing off possibilities by sending a message of restriction and punishment, these tales opened up the prospect of a new kind of world, a world that contrasts with the world of everyday experience. And fictions were one of the few ways to deliver such a promise. The tales of the legendary Pirs tended to be exploratory. Their heroes test-driving different strategies of survival that derive from a Musalmani perspective, a Musalmani way of thinking through problems in an environment that was not yet fully accustomed to, nor fully accommodating of those alternatives. The Bangla-speaking world was still in the throes of its religious transformation of domesticating the region, its space and place, its culture for Islam. This exploratory mode, the world of the subjunctive, I will argue, is central to the work of the Pir Kathas. And that exploration pushes the boundaries by the comfortable and easy use of the fantastic and the marvelous, precisely the elements decried by reformers and avoided by most historians even today. Following Shahab Ahmed's lead, I realized that these historical romances and adventure tales of the Pirs were instructional, but in an entirely different mode, the former using the prescriptive authority of the legalistic reformers, the other the explorative authority of the Sufi masters. But it was hard for me to imagine how these subgenres were related apart from a very general function. Then one day I stumbled across a text called the Iblis Namah. Well, I didn't exactly stumble across it. I dredged it up from the bowels of the library on purpose, and it changed everything. The Iblis Namah by Garli Bula. If you go to the next slide. This was my first encounter with the Iblis Namah, and you can see this particular text maybe looks like it was found in about the 4th level of hell. And you go to the next one too, if you would. So my first encounter with the text was, what shall we say, a little rough. But I did, in fact, discover a number of copies of this text, different versions of the text, in the British Library. So Gardi Bula's 19th century Iblis Namah is in some ways representative, I think, of the Nasihat Namas instructional genre, for it proposes a fictional narrative that juxtaposes the twin worlds of piety and goodness against the evil destruction of humanity through improper conduct, with instruction delivered by characters well known to any Muslim, Muhammad on the one hand and Iblis or Shaitan on the other. But what made it important for my understanding of the genre of Nasihat Namas was its function as a kind of bridge to both sides of the genre. It was not fully one or the other. A text that showed how the two subgenres connected, how they could be straddled. I soon discovered that the Iblis Namah was not unique. The combination of historical figures presented in fictive scenarios to deliver instruction was not an isolated phenomenon. But how did this fiction work? When I work really hard, I sweat. Tejas. The conceit of the Iblis Namah is the colloquy of Iblis and Muhammad. But the trajectory of the narrative, interestingly, parallels that of the Miraj. In fact, it is an overt parody of it. Parody here in the sense of positive mimicry. In the Miraj, Muhammad ascends the seven heavens in order to negotiate with Allah, and that's the Bengali spelling of Allah, over prescribed ritual. Here, Iblis rises up from the seven hells to converse with Muhammad. This narrative move, suggesting a parallel relationship, that is, Allah is to Muhammad as Muhammad is to Iblis, introduces a certain ambiguity with respect to Iblis's nature, and an ambiguity that is prominent in the larger pan-Islamic theology surrounding Iblis. And I could give you citations, but will not do that. It does, however, give the reader pause. The story is a fiction with no sanctioned basis, though the basic frame narrative does emerge in other contexts and languages as well. The Iblis Namah does travel. As Bakhtin, Mashari, and other literary critics have noted, fictions cannot render religion because they can only mimic it, producing a simulacrum that in turn serves as a comment on, a critique of the reality it is mimicking. If it does produce a theological system or overt moral instruction, it ceases to be a fiction but is reduced to religious propaganda. So then, what is being critiqued in this fiction? In the opening section, the author laments that illiterates cannot fully grasp the full glory of Allah as it is described in Persian or Arabic, so he wrote in Bangla so that they may understand the graciousness and greatness of God. Note the commonly circulated refrain of the alleged ignorance of Bengali speakers and the weakness of the Bangla language. But to write in Bangla required the permission of his murshid, which was duly granted. The already noted implication was that Bangla was not considered a proper medium for such instruction, but permission was granted nonetheless, and he was told basically not to worry about it. He writes, "First, by chanting Bismillah, I begin in the name of God. Listen, brothers, to the glory of that name. Learned scholars can translate that glory into Persian, but people being uneducated do not understand it. Listen to me, my brethren. This is why I have done this into Bangla. I write simply to be understood. Because no one can understand either Persian or Arabic, where is the glorification? So some tiny portion of the greatness of Allah I will now try to narrate in the form of this book. According to the command and permission of my spiritual guide, I composed this book using Bangla speech to explain better what is not understood." Now, with his teacher's imprimatur, the author begins with a recitation of Surat Ar-Rahman, the Quran, Surah 55. The recitation is a combination of translation and paraphrase of the surah into Bengali, but amplified in the form of a running commentary which covers the next 4 pages, about 120 lines. The content of that surah is precisely what he laments his fellow Bangla speakers cannot understand through their language: the majesty and greatness of God and the wonder of his creation. The language is not up to it, yet here it is being told in Bangla. The description of God's fabulous creation ends with the fact that Iblis is always present on his throne, leading astray those who are weak of heart and mind. It is his actions that the author has chosen to recite, but does so with trepidation. Then he describes the arrival of Iblis. The single eye of Iblis is blood red, his face black as pitch, his countenance hideously ugly. His head dramatically distends upward. He has no hair on his body, just blood as the skin's surface. Another alternative would be pooling on the skin's surface. But with Muhammad unruffled, the conversation then began. Now, the language issue appears to have been resolved by virtue of the fact that the author simply plunged in. But the issue is actually displaced onto another plane. The remote possibility of such a conversation between Iblis and Muhammad in the first place, and the nature of any conversation that might have ensued. The author recognized that a colloquy between Muhammad and Iblis presented a seemingly intractable problem. At least a few fatwas have been issued decreeing such a conversation impossible, which underscores that the text in hand was deemed a fiction, and an unhealthy one at that. Their argument, acknowledged by our author Gharib, goes like this. Muhammad suffers no liars, and Iblis is inveterate in this regard. He can never be trusted to speak the truth. The issue could only be resolved when Iblis, who functions as God's opponent but never ceases to be loyal, took an oath in the name of God to tell the truth. Iblis approached Muhammad. Iblis says, I'm a wretched person in this world. I cannot lie in front of my Lord. You are a friend of Allah and I a sinner. I have come to you at the command of Allah. The Creator has sent me to your lordship. Whatever you may ask, I am ready to answer. I myself am all falsehood, and so is my reign. You can never expect me to speak the truth. Notice how he says, I promise to speak the truth, but you can never expect me to speak the truth. But standing in the presence of my Lord, I'm not going to lie. If I'm found to be a liar, may I be burnt to ashes. And for those of you who know the makeup of the jinn and Iblis, he can't be reduced to ashes because of his connection with fire. On hearing what Iblis said, the prophet commanded Iblis to take his seat. The prophet asked Iblis, in this world, do you ever wish well for anyone? Who are your friends in this world? Who all obey your orders? Now, before plunging into the narrative, the question whether or not Muhammad can be made to speak in Bangla, does he even know Bangla, seems to be resolved by the declaration that the author himself took an oath to tell the truth about the reality of Iblis, the oath taken in the presence of the prophet, who will guarantee proper delivery, just as Iblis promised to tell the truth in the prophet's presence. The notion of truth here underscores, I think, the author's uneasy concern regarding the fiction that he has generated. Now, the litany of types of followers Iblis gathers around him and the trail of tears they leave in their wake occupies the rest of the text in a predictable chronicle. The first question, Muhammad asks, who are your friends in this world? Who all obey your orders? And Iblis replied, those who are addicts to alcohol. All those are my friends on earth. All my friends on earth drink intoxicants. They lie here and there on the roads and look so disheveled, it's as if they were dead. All of your followers eat lawful halal foods. Each and every one of those are my enemies in this world. It is stated in the scripture that when one takes country liquor and chants Bismillah as it is poured in the mouth, right then and there, that pathetic human is discarded as kafir. That makes me happy. So I join their gatherings. The more they drink, the better I feel. Afterwards, they loot, fight, and fornicate. Now, what should now be seen as a familiar refrain, women, of course, are often singled out as the root of much of the mischief, but so too men who abuse them. Iblis claims among his followers those who do not get along with their own wives. They shower abuse and beat their wives, and wives, too, beat their husbands for their indiscretions. A son born of a woman who is not the man's wife is illegitimate. That kind of an ill-conceived son aggravates mischief. Those men and women are all great friends of mine. I never lose them. They're like the apple of my eye. People in the markets and even in masjids and other gathering places are fair game for Iblis. The former because of their greed and lending practices, the latter for their indulgent excesses. And, you know, as an aside, I have to say, one can only wonder if this is aimed at the entrepreneurial spirit of Calcutta at the time and the habits of a faction of the Ashraf, or perhaps in anticipation of the Bengali embrace of Marx's critique of capitalism, which seemed to reigned supreme in the 20th century. But the overwhelming number of individuals who fall into the ranks of Iblis's followers are people who violate their ritual obligations, from forgetting to wash after urinating and then going straight to prayer, or who urinate in the direction of Mecca, or who improperly perform namaz, or who keep a dog in the house. In the last third of the text, the tribulations of hell and the afterlife are graphically portrayed, including another extended diatribe against false peers and their gullible followers. Now, by our contemporary standards, the text might easily be faulted for being highly repetitive through redundant periphrasis, echoing and parroting earlier passages, and when I first read it, I was not so generous in my characterizations. No doubt these apparent literary deficiencies count among those criticisms voiced by the literary historians who dismiss the genre as a whole. But we should consider the rhetorical effect of its delivery. Not composed as a chirographic text designed for close study, and almost certainly intended to be read aloud to an illiterate audience, every small section that might be used as a springboard for a sermon or other homiletic session would include a reprise of the message of the text as a whole. One can open the book almost anywhere after the first 4 pages and find essentially the same message repeated in 3 to 5 page blocks. As a practical document, it is easy to see how effective this might be. No matter where you start, you get the whole in a few pages, and it doesn't take very long. And in this light, the text seems to align itself perfectly with the moralizing Nasihat Namas tales. And so, for a long time I was very confused by this. What is the effect then of it being a fiction? Is it a fiction at all? Now, when Bakhtin and Mashari tell us that any fiction is by its nature automatically commenting on or critiquing ordinary discourse, we might well ask, what is the object here? Since the message seems perfectly consistent with the ongoing critiques of Bengali Muslims generally found in the moralizing Nasihat Namas text. Where is the critique? The fiction seems all too real. And here I'm rescued, at least somewhat, by Wolfgang Iser, who provides a nuanced insight into the mechanisms by which fictions are real. For the short version, I refer you to an essay titled The Reality of Fiction, a functionalist approach to literature, which he wrote back in the 70s, but which was the foundational essay for his more expansive works on reader response criticism. Briefly, Iser argues that every work of fiction inherits a context that includes the prevailing ideologies and assumptions of the historical time and place, and that these conventions, which are necessary for the text to establish a situation, serve as the repertoire of the text. The accepted procedures the author adopts are the narrative strategies, and the reader's participation he designates the realization of the text. It should be noted here that I've addressed precisely these issues in Witness to Marvels, but using a somewhat more focused tack of analyzing the forms of explicit and implicit intertextuality and the pragmatic and logical presuppositions they entail. And so I refer you to chapters 4 and 5. Every system of thought, and this is Iser, every cultural organization or order chooses and hierarchizes its values. But fiction cannot reproduce this in whole. It can only refer to it while supplying those possibilities that have been excluded by the prevalent system, making fiction then a complement to reality rather than its opposite. That is, fiction is not real. In other words, the literary work implicitly draws an outline of the prevailing system by explicitly shading in the areas all around the system, throwing it into relief. When we examine more carefully the narrative strategies of the Iblis Namah, we must reassess our initial evaluation that saw in the colloquy of Muhammad and Iblis the reification and reinforcement of the moralistic Nasihat Namas subgenre. From the perspective of doctrinal content, the text produces a negative image of a hadith, that is, Iser's shaded area around the system. The narrative does not describe or prescribe proper action appropriate to the followers of God. Rather, it rehearses what people do as followers of Iblis, which is the opposite of the followers of God. It seems then to proscribe those perfidious activities only by inference without ever spelling it out. As a fiction, the text differentiates itself from the expected hortatory mode of moral injunction by inverting it, by playful manipulation. The most familiar strategy in the moralizing subgenre is for the text to positively stipulate in a very declarative mood what a good practicing Muslim should do, and then pressure the auditor to emulate those actions by threatening damnation if Iblis is allowed to entice the unwary away from the well-trodden path. Gharib's Iblis Namah, however, takes a very different tack, one of inversion, negatively describing these actions of those who are not good Muslims. Where most texts of this genre will use the tale to counsel, admonish, and exhort the passive but attentive recipient regarding instruction, this Iblis Namah introduces a much less hortatory, more individually heuristic move that invites the listener to engage his or her own critical faculties in order to infer what constitutes right action and make a conscientious choice. The auditor, that is, the reader or listener, must construct the meaning for him or herself. And that turns out to be perfectly consistent with Iser's prediction regarding the very functions of fiction. And I apologize for the abbreviated presentation of Iser. It does not do his very sophisticated work justice, but these two paragraphs really pull out, I think, a very profound point. The repertoire reproduces the familiar, but strips it of its current validity. What it does not do, however, is formulate alternative values such as one might expect after a process of negation. Unlike the philosophies and ideologies, literature does not make its selections and its decisions explicit. Instead, it questions or recodes the signals of external reality in such a way, and this emphasis is mine, the reader himself is to find the motives underlying the questions, and in doing so, he participates in producing the meaning. If the literary work, and then this is in the same, actually the very next paragraph, if the literary work arises out of the reader's own social or philosophical background, it will serve to detach prevailing norms from their functional context, thus enabling the reader to observe how such social regulators actually function and what effect they have on the people subject to them. And again, the emphasis is mine here. The reader is thus placed in a position from which he can take a fresh look at the forces which guide and orient him and which he may have hitherto accepted without question. So we can see now how the fiction of the Iblis Namah worked. The action of the text parodied the movement of the Miraj, Muhammad to heaven, Iblis brought up from the underworld. But it inverted the raison d'etre. Muhammad went first to tour hell and then up through the heavens to pray with the prophets before bargaining about ritual obligation with God. Conversely, Iblis was summoned up from hell, and you'll note the geography here is different from sort of the standard you will find elsewhere. There's definitely 7 hells down below. He's summoned to be questioned to explain what his followers do, which is the opposite of the ritual obligations of a good Muslim. And the author hedged his bets. His concern about putting wrong or false words in the mouth of Muhammad was eliminated by reducing Muhammad's speech to the same question over and over, a question that contained no substance regarding belief or practice. So the author does not risk misrepresenting, that is, he does not risk falsehood or heresy by putting words in Muhammad's mouth that might prove to be untrue or at least challenged. Substantive speech, however, is placed exclusively in the mouth of Iblis. And since all descriptions of the behavior of his followers are the opposite of what a good Muslim should attempt to do, then there can be no offense, for the author knows his ahadith. He is neither prescribing nor proscribing action which could put him in a position of inadvertently misleading his readers. But whether it is right or wrong, the author will not be held accountable because every action and every word of Iblis is in and of itself untrustworthy. And as he noted on several occasions, Iblis always lies. So the author is relieved of all responsibility. But determining the truth or falsity of what is conveyed falls in turn on his various audiences, who are expected to exercise their own rational faculties to infer a proper form of action. So following Iser and getting a glimpse of how these fictions have worked, the myriad of the romantic and marvelous tales produced by the various Sufi teachers can be read as the flip side of the moralizing tales of the Sharia-minded preachers. The one exhorts, the other gently persuades one to think, but throwing into relief what the world actually presents. So now I think we're in a better position, after looking at this straddling text, to understand the new tales that emerge in the marvelous subgenre. And this is apart from the ones that migrated from the earlier period that I've already analyzed. For instance, the tale of Laomun in the Laomuner Ketsa, a heroine who turns every stereotype of woman on its head. She's learned and reads and writes. She cross-dresses and fights as a Lascar. She slays wild rhinos and subdues witches. She finances the construction of a masjid, and she takes a woman as her second spouse in addition to her husband, all in the process of setting right the world that her husband wrecked. For those who are interested, this is the first tale out of the Fabulous Females and Peerless Peers translations that I did a number of years ago, and that Shahzad mentioned. Or take the saga of the great Bengali maiden Bhanubhoti Bibi, who defeats Muhammad's son-in-law Ali in battle and then marries him. And the story of the British merchants who kidnapped Hassan and Hussein and spirited them away on merchant steamers, only to have Ali come and rescue them. Take the strange tale of Yasiman Bibi, whose home is repeatedly plundered and burned by thieves, only to have the primary lawbreaker and leader of the gang, when caught, spout hadith in defense of his criminal actions. Or perhaps most intriguing of this small set, the tale of Isa, or Jesus, who, as he walked along a rough path, picked up the skull of a former great king, Sultan Jomjoma, resurrected him bodily from hell in order to interrogate him about how such a good king could be suffering so and what hell was really like, only then to send him back for more, until which time he could burn off and atone for his offenses and enter paradise. Note the Christian perspective of purgatory creeping in here. And so forth and so on, with a host of other tales. So in conclusion, I would say that the Nasihat Namas genre turns out to be a considerably more complex set of texts that seem on the surface to run in exact opposite directions, but in which in their final analysis concur on the rightness of the Islamic perspective on the world and what constitutes proper action. While the moralizing style is preached to be accepted according to the dictates of hadith, as understood by various preachers, the fictional side seeks to persuade the auditor more subtly, a persuasion aided by the direct intervention of the Sufi peer as author and narrator, a living authority. Both styles seek to persuade, one by demanding rational assent to the propositions of the faith, the other by quietly confirming the rightness of the Islamic perspective, ingeniously cementing other processes of conversion and piety. And as I've demonstrated elsewhere, the subjunctive nature of fictions, exploring what might be, we can now clearly see also confirm for the reader or auditor what the reality really is. Sorry, I just stole the last page of your of your essay. Thank you very much. Yeah, absolutely. I can't guarantee I'll answer them, but I'll try.
First of all, just thank you very much for your talk. I was wondering whether you could speak to the ways in which these discourses, which seem to be defining a sort of Bengali Islam or Bengali Muslims, relate, if at all, to quote-unquote non-fictional discourses around the same time in the 19th or 20th centuries, which would be invested in doing the same thing, like more socio-political discourses around independence or nationalism, so on and so forth. And also on a related note, what the fate of these chapbooks might have been later on into the 20th century, and whether or not the sort of dramatic events of 1947 or 52 or 71 have any sort of effect on how these works are produced and read, whether or not the literary communities that are kind of consuming these works might have been also reading other works which might suffer from the same sort of analytical problems that you were mentioning towards the beginning of your talk, on how Bengali language trade unionist newspapers or pamphlets also suffer from a sort of lack of acknowledgement that there are also Bengali Muslims writing these sorts of things and engaging in the same politics.
Good. There's several good questions there. First, there do not seem to be any new tales that I have been able to locate emerging in the last 40 or 50 years. However, the tales are continuing to be printed, and last time I was in Calcutta, I picked up about a half a dozen of these Nasihat Namas that had, one of them said, I think, 90-second printing, just to give you an idea of the prolix nature of it. There is a vast, well, actually, let me add to that. In terms of the collecting policies that have hidden these things, when I was at the University of Chicago, these texts were classified as ephemera, and therefore they were not cataloged. They were these and other pamphlets. They called it pamphlet literature. They were in large file cabinets with just little, slips of paper put in them, and anybody who wanted could go and look at them. But don't bother, because it's unserious kind of stuff. Not now. And I might add that if you're interested in these literatures, I just donated about 75 of these to the Center for Research Libraries a couple of years ago. So they are freely available, downloadable, et cetera. But there was a wide debate among the intellectual communities. And Nilesh Bose has written extensively about this. The number of journals that were generated debating the nature of literature in Musulmani Bangla versus Shadu Basha, the pure speech, as it was often referred to, the elegant high register of Calcutta-based Bangla. Some arguing that they needed very much for their own identity to continue to write in Musulmani Bangla, and others were saying, no, if we do that, we isolate ourselves, write in Shadu Basha, which any Bengali reading it will be able to understand. And that debate raged for decades. And it took different forms, but that, in a nutshell, was one of the biggest debates. There are scores of journals that where you can document these debates, and they sometimes stretch for decades. Just every month or every few months coming out with a new version, and they would debate whether it was appropriate for Musulmani, for Bengali Muslims to be a part of the new nation, whether or not they should, and this is long before anybody thought about partition, but whether they should even participate in this colonial experiment. And then there were others, of course, that said absolutely, we're Bengali, and Bengalis are part of the empire, and when we get an independent India, Bengal will be front and center. So again, those debates certainly were carried on. The business of colonial restriction and the threat of sedition definitely affected how things were written. Epshita Haldar, that I mentioned earlier, has done a study that has not been published yet, but which you should keep your eye out for, is a study of the Karbala narratives as a focal point for establishing a proper Shi'i versus Sunni identity, and that it raged in the journal literature over decades. And again, with all the other factors, playing into these arguments, and you see the intellectual community really exploring possibilities that most of the stories of the Bengal Renaissance just simply ignore. I mean, they just don't have any of it documented. So Nilesh's book is really important. Sufi-ud-Din's book touches on some of this. And then, let's see, Rafiuddin Ahmed has written again, but touching, sort of grazing past it rather than really addressing it. And just to give you an idea of how untouched this literature is, as far as I know, I'm the only person who's ever translated a Nasihat Namas. I mean, just think about that. And I've translated several of them, including the Iblis Namah. But they just, they're talked about and dismissed, and that's it. The fact is that we don't know just how extensive this literature is. And we don't know then what some of the issues were really concerning people, because we only have snippets, it's like a sampling rather than a large set. So we know it's there. The journal literature points to the fact that it's there, but it's absent in some ways. Did that answer your question or not?
Yeah, no, completely. I was, if I could ask
Sure.
a brief follow-up, do you see any traces of those same debates that you're mentioning right now in the tales that you've translated or worked on for this newest work, like the Sufi fictions that have been inherited from older times? Like, are there reconfigurings and the shortenings that reflect any sort of engagement with those?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, and the way it comes out is not so much in the print literature, but in drama, jatra, in the public so-called folk theater. And last time I was in Bangladesh, I went to a performance of Gaji Kalu Champavati, which is a 6th century old tale. And what they do is they insert the local officials, the person who's the MP or whatever, into the text as the bad guy or the good guy, depending on the mood. So they make them relevant, and they address issues like taxation, the redistricting of the lands, what to do with the chore lands that come up when the river changes course and new islands come up and other land is submerged, how to deal with that in the courts, things like that. So really issues of tremendous local importance continue to be referenced, at least, in these performances. And I think that's part of what keeps these things alive. But like the Gaji Kalu story has been circulating now for 6 centuries, and the fact that it has been ignored all this time, and the fact that it has a 700-page manuscript, and it's still being told, tells me that it's doing something. And the question for the book, and what I'm still asking, is what exactly is it doing? What's the cultural work that's being undertaken?
Hi, mine is more like a clarification. I was wondering about the usage of your term Islamist for the kind of narratives which kind of critiqued these kind of stories so far back in time, and considering what it would mean in the present context.
Well, I only used the word once, Islamist, and it was in direct reference to the critiquing, the ultra-conservative critiquing of, in the moralizing tales of the actions of Muslims. It's sort of many of these Nasihat Namas anticipate, and of course they're also being affected by the Deoband reform movements and that kind of thing toward the end. And we do see some of that. But I'm not trying to make a historical argument in the sense of at this moment, we have an Islamist reality, but rather Islamist clearly emerging as a perspective which does characterize a lot of the Nasihat Namas. And interestingly enough, many of those are still being reproduced. The ones, for instance, that blame women for, cyclones and all this stuff. The really, really conservative ones do still seem to have a bit of a life, which I don't know what to make of. I'm not a historian. I don't work generally in the 19th or 20th century, except for occasional forays where I stick my neck out. And I'm a 14th, 18th century person. But I don't mean to suggest then that there is a political moment when that terminology. And I haven't read those. As I said, I avoided reading those moralizing tales because I found them so dreary personally. And I think maybe that was because I was born in a Southern Baptist family in the South, and I'd had enough of it, for God's sake. And I mean, we have to admit our prejudices here. I like stories. I don't like to be told what I'm doing wrong. Other questions? Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much for coming. We met about 10 years ago in Bangladesh when I was doing the critical language scholarship program.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so it was very brief a while back.
It's good to see you.
The question I had was, do we know who the audience was specifically that bought these books, or is that something that's not very well known today?
There's almost no way to record or discover. There's no record of who bought them, but they're incredibly inexpensive. That we do know. And they're printed cheaply on cheap paper, and they're often classified as battola, which is the lowest form of printing in Bangladesh and Bengal. So in that sense, they clearly were not meant necessarily for an elite audience, although the original longer tales that I worked on in the book were clearly meant for elite audiences, coming out of a court culture, actually, and with very sophisticated handling of things like aesthetic theory and so forth. That gets truncated down when print comes along. And perhaps even further, when the author, editor / murshid introduces himself more and more into the text, the narrative gets more and more truncated and more commentary. And it's embedded into the text as if it were part of it, but it's actually new insertions. And I found multiple editions by the same editor, and it's very interesting to watch it transform over 30 years or 40 years, the same text being printed and reprinted with all this new material being added. So who got them? Well, they were so cheap that you could expect a wide audience. But the fact is most people whoever bought them, one person would read aloud because most people couldn't read. And so you have it doesn't take much to get, to share the word there. I don't know if that answers your question, but. Anybody else?
Thank you. I'm not entirely sure whether this is a good question to ask you, but because it's tangential to your analysis.
Usually the best kind.
So one of the very interesting and fascinating things about your reading of this material is how you are excavating and actually thinking through what the social content is, and especially because in the fictional side of things, how it's more than what meets the eye in terms of your own experience and then thinking through it, etc. Now, a lot of the projection that you're showing has to do with kind of homiletic purpose in terms of how to live, etc. Now, but in the stories themselves, certainly to some degree in the Shaitan and Muhammad one, but it would be even more so in the Karbala narratives, there is a claim being made about the past as well, right? And so the homiletic purpose of that, it comes across very well in what you're narrating, and also, for example, thinking about the division between Sunni and Shia and how it would be articulated or projected through this narrative. But I'm wondering, is there a reflection in the material, or can one speculate more based upon how it's done about how truth claims about the past are made, right? So, because of my own interest, I'm interested in how the past is made an object and then utilized. So the utilization part in these cases is very clear. I'm wondering if you can say more, or is there more to say about the past as an object as it is in the material, and how that might tell us something about both the ideational and the social world within which these are happening. And a part of the reason I'm asking is because one of the things that's happening in the 19th century, certainly in India, but also generally, is the notion of the past is changing radically, right? And what past can be told, not told. So, does that make sense?
Yeah. First of all, the Karbala narratives do not appear in the Nasihat Namas literature more than in a very passing way. I was very surprised. There's for the first time in the history of the Bangla Bibag, which is the Bengali department at Calcutta University, a young man just finished a dissertation on the Nasihat Namas, but all it is basically is a catalog and a telling of the stories. But it's the first time that anybody has done this, and I thumbed through. He had about 180 texts that he had found, and most of which are actually still in print because he had modern editions of them. And as I recall, there was one or two that dealt with Karbala. The Karbala issue, as Epshita argues, is found in the journal editorializing, which is much more about the creation of a Bengali Muslim identity in the 19th century, and one faction saying that the Shi'i identity was unique because of the Karbala narrative, the other faction saying no, because Muhammad actually predicted what was going to happen. This is actually nothing more than a subset of the original life of Muhammad and so forth. And so that was the Sunni side, and so there's this debate that goes back and forth. As far as the role of history, what I see these texts really doing, and so it's sort of insinuating themselves into a history rather than trying to make claims about history, is that all of the fictional tales really pretty much seem to suggest that Bengal is a happy home for Islam, and that Bengali culture is and should be understood to be fully integrated and integratable into a larger world history of an Islamic world history, and which for a lot of people that was world history, at least at the beginning of the 19th century. And so in that sense, it's domesticating the space and place of Bengal to integrate it into these larger narratives, rather than trying to take a stand about, a specific history. And this is why, for instance, we get Shonaban, who debates Hanif, and she bests him in debate and forces him to marry her. Now, she's a Hindu, and he's not. This Boti Bibi, who fights Ali and beats him, and then is married to him. And see, that incorporates Bengal into this larger history. And I think that's the kind of thing. I also thought it was the British merchants kidnapping Hassan Hussein and steaming up the Gulf in their steamers, and then Ali has to come and smash them. It has in effect the same thing. That's very clearly an anti-colonial statement, but also an incorporating kind of statement where Bengalis are part of this larger narrative, and that's how I would see most of these working. But again, I'm not sure how far I want to generalize, because I haven't read all of them. I've read a bunch of them, and I don't see the question of history apart from trying to integrate Bengal into this larger history as really a kind of point of overt argument, but rather a kind of insinuation by the telling of the story.
Okay, that's very helpful. Yeah.
Just kind of on that point, to follow up, I was wondering whether you have ever come across any sort of discourse on another part of imagining and fiction, like the dream world in the Bengal for these Bengali Muslims, where you have a sense for portents, omens, things that can happen that have real significance. I'm thinking of, for example, like around 1857, a lot of dreams and these figures like Muhammad Ali, they appear in dreams. Omar, he'll appear in a dream, he'll do something, and it is reflective of this sort of real world situation in the same way that Ali can appear on a steamship, as you were saying, and rescue Hassan and Hussein. So there's some sort of truth that goes beyond the empirical documentation of what might have happened to a reality that is produced in affinity to what 7th century Arabia might have been, right? And these figures tend to appear again. Like, is there any sense you have when reading appearances of figures like Ali or Muhammad in these Nasihat Namas or in any of these fictions that gives at least a possible reading or interpretation that what's going on here is actually a reflection of, well, since Ali would have boarded the steamship against the British merchants who kidnapped Hassan and Hussein, which is what the British merchants would have done, then this is actually, there is some form of truth that goes beyond fiction that's being relayed through this narrative. Is that kind of clear? Or?
Yeah, I don't think the Nasihat Namas would address that. In fact, dreams don't show up very much in these tales. They do occasionally, but they're no more fantastic or revealing than the marvelous things that they're doing in the first place. You know, the can we go back one? The Hur party who is you know, lifting up people and flying them to other lands, you know, for the night, and like in the Gaji Kalu story, for instance, which is why this is here. Just like in Arabian Nights, you know, that kind of thing. So the distinction between a dream world and a non-dream world in the fictional tales is not quite as clear-cut, and dreams per se really don't. I mean, sometimes Kalu, who's the more sober-minded brother of Gaji, who's smitten with Champavati, you know, Kalu will say, you know, you're dreaming, get a grip, you know. I mean, but it's more, you know, as we would use that expression, you know, rather than saying the explicit content of a dream. So I don't see that as part of it. Now, in terms of, you know, being able to read responses to historical events, one could also argue that the kidnapping of Hassan and Hussein by the British and putting them on a steamer, and they are only rescued when they get to Arabia by Ali. This is exactly the time when the British took over the entire pilgrimage transport network of steamers. And if you wanted to go on the Hajj, you had to use the British steamer. And so, you know, you don't know if this is a kind of response to that, or, you know, a kind of critique of the wrongness of the British, you know, doing this kind of thing. And are they actually, you know, taking us out of the country and kidnapping us, and, you know, will we even get back? I mean, you could try to read some of those things, but I'm reluctant to try and read the fictions against historical moments unless there's some very explicit reason to do so. So you know, it's possible, but you know, whether it's probable is another issue. I just in general, I'm uneasy with the fictions as sources of history, but more as indexing things that are important in a culture, that are needing exploration, but may not articulate explicitly, is about as far as I'm willing to go with it. You guys have been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much. And outside the books are available for signing for anyone inclined. Thank you very much, Tony.
Yeah, my pleasure.